An elderly black woman boards her flight, first-class ticket in hand. She settles into her seat 1A, her scarf neat, her dignity intact, but a flight attendant looms over her, demanding she move. And why? Because the attendant's own sister wants that seat. Humiliated, the woman is forced to stand, clutching her ticket while others look away. Cameras record, but no one speaks. What the crew did not know was who her son was. When he stepped onto that plane, the humiliation of one quiet woman turned into a storm that shook the entire airline. By the end, the world would know her name, and her dignity would be restored for millions to see. That morning, as she walked through the polished halls of the international terminal, there was no nervousness, no hesitation in her step. She had been on flights countless times before. This wasn't a novelty, yet every flight carried a small weight for her, the unspoken question of how she would be treated this time. Her son, Marcus Robinson, was the CEO of Skyline Airways, the very airline she was boarding today. But she never liked to announce that fact. She wanted to be treated like any other passenger, without privilege, without favoritism. What she longed for was fairness, the simple dignity of being respected in the same way that others were. At the check-in counter, she handed over her passport and boarding pass with a polite smile. The young woman behind the counter glanced at the document, then at Clara. Her brow furrowed for a split second before she plastered on a strained smile. "First class?" she asked, as though confirming the impossible. "Yes," Clara replied gently, though she caught the subtle edge in the woman's tone. It was not curiosity, it was doubt. The agent scanned her ticket twice as though searching for an error, before finally nodding. "All set," she said flatly, pushing the documents back toward Clara. There was no warmth, no courtesy, just a quiet message hidden in her eyes. "You don't belong here." Clara thanked her anyway and moved on. At security, the same pattern repeated. Though she cleared the scanner without alarm, an officer pulled her aside for a random check. They rummaged through her handbag, touched her scarf with gloved hands, and asked her to step aside. She said nothing, only waited patiently as other passengers streamed by, some glancing at her with the faintest trace of pity, others with annoyance. By the time she reached the gate, she carried herself as upright as ever, but inside the familiar ache pressed at her chest. She was used to these slights, yet they still stung. The boarding announcement called for first-class passengers. Clara rose gracefully, her scarf trailing slightly as she walked toward the jet bridge. Heads turned as she moved past rows of economy travelers. She felt their eyes, heard the unspoken question in their gazes. Her? First class? She didn't flinch. At the aircraft door, a flight attendant welcomed her with a polished smile that faltered when she saw Clara's ticket. "Oh," she said, quickly recovering. "Welcome aboard." Clara nodded, stepped past her, and entered the cabin. The first-class section spread out before her wide leather seats, soft lighting, calm air. It was not new to her, but it was still a reminder of what her son had built. A company that set the standard for air travel. A company he had built from the ground up, carrying their family name into a space once unthinkable. Her assigned seat was 1A, the front left window. She placed her small handbag by her feet and eased into the wide chair. Adjusting her scarf, she folded her hands in her lap and let herself breathe. Other passengers filed in. A businessman glanced her way, then quickly looked back at his phone. A younger couple whispered as they walked past, their eyes flicking toward her before darting away. She could read it, all the assumptions, the quiet surprise that a woman like her sat in a place like this. But Clara was not one to shrink. She met each glance with calm poise, her posture a declaration. "I am here, and this seat is mine." To Clara, occupying that space was not about indulgence. It was about affirmation that no matter her age, her color, or the biases of strangers, she had a right to be treated with respect. What she could not yet know was that this very seat, her rightful place, would soon be stolen from her in plain sight, not by mistake, not by error, but through humiliation carried out with deliberate cruelty. And the crew she trusted to protect her dignity would be the very ones who stripped it away. Clara sat back in seat 1A, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and watched as other first-class passengers filtered in. She had always been a people watcher, the businessman who typed furiously on his laptop, the couple murmuring sweetly to each other, the anxious traveler glancing up at the overhead bins as though afraid something might vanish. It was ordinary, and yet she felt the undercurrent. Eyes flicked toward her and away just as quickly, the same glance repeated in different faces, surprise and then dismissal. She could almost hear the questions whispered behind those stares. How did she get here? Was there a mix-up? She adjusted her scarf and lifted her chin. She would not shrink. One of the younger flight attendants came down the aisle with a tray of pre-departure drinks. Her smile was wide and bright as she offered champagne and orange juice to a white couple in 1B and 1C. When she reached Clara, the brightness dimmed. The attendant's tone shifted sharper, more transactional. "Water?" she asked without warmth. Clara looked at the tray, then back at her. "I'll have the orange juice, please." The attendant hesitated, almost as if she hadn't expected Clara to ask for the same options as the others. She set down the glass with a clipped, "Here." Clara took it, her expression unchanging. But the sting sat heavy. It was small a tone, a hesitation, but she had endured such cuts all her life. They accumulated like bruises no one else could see. Moments later, another attendant stopped at her seat. This one, older and stern-faced, glanced at Clara's ticket stub sticking out of her handbag. "You're in 1A?" she asked, voice flat. "Yes," Clara replied evenly. The attendant didn't smile. She gave a slow nod as though reluctantly confirming something, then walked away. Clara sighed softly, the way one does when facing the familiar. She thought of how her son, Marcus, spoke of training his airline staff to prioritize courtesy and fairness. He believed in dignity for every passenger. He didn't know that some prejudices ran deeper than training manuals, that bias could slip through smiles, through tones of voice, through something as simple as a glass of juice set down with indifference. As the cabin filled, Clara overheard snippets of conversation. A man across the aisle joked lightly to his companion, "Guess they're letting anyone in first class these days." He didn't lower his voice enough. His companion chuckled, then glanced quickly toward Clara. Clara's face did not flinch, though inside her heart pressed against her ribs. She had lived long enough to know when she was the subject of such remarks. She sipped her juice slowly, letting the cool sweetness calm her. She would not give them the satisfaction of reaction. When boarding slowed, a tall, sharply dressed woman entered, not a passenger, but a crew member who clearly wasn't on duty. Her uniform was absent, but her presence carried the same air of ownership. She walked confidently toward the flight attendants clustered at the galley and exchanged greetings with familiarity. Clara caught snippets, laughter, a sisterly hug, introductions. It became clear she was family. Clara thought nothing of it at first, assuming she was just there to see her sister off. But then the woman lingered. She stood in the aisle chatting, her gaze sweeping over the cabin, landing briefly on Clara before sliding away. There was something in that look, a dismissal, a silent claim of territory. Clara adjusted her scarf again, steadying herself. She had the uneasy sense that the day was about to test her more than usual. The plane doors closed, the hum of the engines deepened, and the captain's voice came over the intercom with a calm welcome. Clara folded her hands once more, her back straight, her dignity intact. Yet beneath her composure, a ripple of tension began to stir. The glances, the clipped tones, the careless remark, these were not isolated. They were the opening notes of a song she knew too well. And she feared that soon the melody would grow louder. Clara Robinson had settled into seat 1A with quiet satisfaction. Her handbag was tucked neatly by her feet, her scarf rested against the armrest, and she sat upright, calm and prepared for the journey ahead. The boarding pass stub lay across her lap, just where she had placed it after checking it twice, a habit of hers, though she knew the number by heart. 1A, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply. The soft hum of passengers boarding around her faded into the background. She had been here before. She knew this space. Yet every time she entered it, she reminded herself, dignity is not a gift given by others. It is something I hold within me, no matter what anyone else decides. The peace lasted only minutes. From the aisle, sharp footsteps approached. Clara opened her eyes to see a tall woman standing over her, hands on her hips, a frown creasing her face. It was the same woman she had seen earlier laughing with the flight attendants in the galley, the sister. "You're in my seat," the woman said flatly, her voice carrying an edge of authority, though she wore no uniform. Clara blinked, composed but firm. "No, ma'am, this is 1A. My ticket confirms it." She touched the stub resting on her lap, then gently held it up. The woman didn't look at the ticket. Instead, she scoffed, her lip curling into a smirk. "I said this is my seat. Move." Clara's chest tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I boarded earlier. I've been seated here since the start. This seat belongs to me." The woman's smirk deepened. She glanced back toward the galley, and within moments the flight attendant and her sister appeared. "What's going on here?" the attendant asked, though her tone was already loaded with irritation. "This woman is in my seat," the sister declared, tilting her head toward Clara. Clara held out her boarding pass, her dignity unshaken. "That's not true. Here is my ticket. Seat 1A. The attendant's eyes flicked to the stub, then back to Clara. She didn't bother examining it properly. Instead, she crossed her arms. "Ma'am, my sister will be sitting here. You'll need to move to another seat." Clara's voice grew firmer, though still respectful. "No, I will not. This is my seat. I have the right to remain here." A flicker of irritation passed over the attendant's face. She leaned down slightly, her words clipped and sharp. "Do you want to fly today or not?" It was not a question, it was a warning. The surrounding passengers had gone silent. The businessman across the aisle lowered his laptop, his eyes shifting between them. The young couple nearby stopped whispering, their gazes frozen on the scene. The weight of dozens of silent witnesses pressed around Clara, yet none spoke. She could feel the heat rising in her chest. To resist further was to risk being painted as difficult, or worse, disruptive. She knew too well what that label could do to a black woman on an airplane. Clara lifted her ticket slightly higher, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. "I have the boarding pass. This seat is mine." The attendant's lips curled into a cold smile. "And I've told you my sister is sitting here. Gather your things." For a moment, Clara considered refusing. She wanted to anchor herself to the seat, to claim what was rightfully hers. But the menace in the attendant's voice, the smirk on the sister's face, the silence of those watching it all closed in around her, like a vice. Slowly, with the grace she had carried her entire life, Clara lifted her handbag. She adjusted her scarf with deliberate calm, and then, with her back still straight, she rose. As she stepped into the aisle, the sister slid into 1A without hesitation, lounging smugly in the wide leather seat as if it had always been hers. The sight burned in Clara's chest, but she refused to let her face betray the pain. Guided by another attendant who offered no kindness, Clara was led toward the rear of the cabin. Her steps were steady, her head held high, though every inch of her being ached with humiliation. This was not a simple mistake. This was not a clerical error. This was the theft of dignity, carried out in public view, sanctioned by silence, enforced by authority. And Clara knew deep inside that this battle was far from over. Clara Robinson walked down the narrow aisle, her boarding pass still clutched in her hand like a useless piece of paper, evidence of truth no one cared to see. Every step felt like it echoed louder than the last, even though the cabin had gone so quiet that the only sounds were the faint hum of engines and the rustle of passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The new seat was in the back, squeezed between a young man in a hoodie scrolling on his phone and a woman clutching a baby. Clara eased herself down carefully, adjusting her scarf, her movements measured, deliberate, like a woman determined not to let her composure fracture, even as her pride was being chipped away. But it didn't stop there. Moments after she sat, the flight attendant, the sister's ally, walked past, pausing just long enough to tilt her head down toward Clara with a thin, mocking smile. "Much better," she said softly, not to reassure, but to wound. Clara looked straight ahead. She had endured worse words in her life, endured decades where silence had been her armor. But here, in front of strangers, the insult burrowed deep. It didn't end with the attendant. Another member of the crew, a blonde woman with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, approached Clara moments later under the guise of checking seat numbers. She leaned down, her voice pitched low enough for nearby passengers to hear, yet soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant to shame. "You must have misunderstood your ticket," she said, her eyes cold. "Happens sometimes. Best to pay closer attention next time." Clara lifted her ticket again. She didn't even speak, she just held it in her hand like a shield. The stub clearly read 1A. The blonde woman didn't glance at it. Instead, she waved dismissively, the motion sharp, almost as though swatting away an insect. "No need to get worked up. You're settled now, aren't you?" Settled. The word stung more than she expected. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about being placed where they thought she belonged. As the crew member moved on, a ripple of whispers passed through the rows around her. Some passengers muttered in discomfort. Others avoided looking at Clara entirely. And then came the final blow, the laughter. From the front of the cabin, Clara could hear it. The sister's voice, warm and light, carried through the air. She was laughing with her sibling, the flight attendant, as though this was all a private joke between them. The cruel, familiar cadence of white women laughing at a black woman's expense. The humiliation thickened in the air like smoke. Clara kept her gaze forward, but her heart raced. She felt her hands tremble slightly against her scarf, and so she clasped them together tightly in her lap to still them. Stay composed, always composed. Dignity first. But the assault didn't end. Another crew member, a younger woman with bright lipstick and a performative smile, approached with a tray of water. She stopped by Clara's row, tilting her head with faux sweetness. "Would you like some water?" she asked. Clara nodded faintly. "Yes, please." The woman's smile thinned as she placed the cup into Clara's hand, but her words sliced the air with a deliberate cruelty. "Here you go, ma'am. Nice and cool. Should help calm those nerves." Her tone made the word ma'am sound like an insult. A chuckle rose from a nearby passenger, feeding off the humiliation. Clara took the cup silently. Her hands were steady again. Her eyes forward. She refused to drink. The water sat in her hand like a test, and she would not give them the satisfaction of sipping it, of appearing grateful for the poison of mockery disguised as kindness. The worst part was not the insults themselves. It was the silence of those who could see the businessman in the aisle seat, who kept his eyes fixed on his laptop though the screen had long gone dark, the young couple who exchanged glances but said nothing. The murmuring passengers who averted their gaze the moment Clara's eyes flickered in their direction. Injustice thrives on silence, and the silence in that cabin was deafening. Still, Clara sat upright. Still, her scarf was neat, her posture proud. She had not been taught to bow her head, not even in humiliation. But deep within, the fire stirred slow, steady, unyielding. They thought they had broken her. They thought they had silenced her. But the story was not finished. Because Clara Robinson, mother of the man who led the very airline they worked for, was not a woman to be dismissed. Clara Robinson sat stiffly in her new seat, her ticket stub balanced neatly in her lap. Around her, passengers settled in, fastening belts, tucking away bags, whispering in low voices. But she felt every eye, every silence pressing on her like a weight. She had been humiliated, forced from the seat she had rightfully purchased, and the sight of the white woman reclined in her 1A burned in her chest. But Clara was not raised to bow. The young attendant with bright lipstick stopped again at her row. "Everything okay here, ma'am?" she asked, the false sweetness sharp as vinegar. Clara met her eyes. "No, it is not." She lifted her ticket slowly, deliberately, so that everyone nearby could see the bold letters. 1A. The attendant froze, her smile stiffening. "Well, she began. "This is my seat," Clara said firmly. Her voice was low, but it carried. Passengers turned their heads. The businessman who had been pretending to type now stared openly. A mother across the aisle shifted her child onto her lap, her eyes locked on Clara. The attendant's cheeks colored. "We've already reassigned you. Best not to cause a scene." Clara didn't blink. "I did not reassign myself. Your crew did, and you know it was wrong." The words hung in the air. For the first time, murmurs rippled through the rows. A young man muttered, "She's got the ticket." Another whispered, "That's not right." The attendant glanced down the aisle nervously, then forced her syrupy smile back into her face. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," she said quickly, retreating. Clara lowered the ticket to her lap, her hands steady. She had not shouted. She had not begged. But she had cracked the silence, and everyone felt it. From the front of the plane, laughter drifted back. The sister in 1A clinked her champagne glass against the flight attendant's water bottle, their chuckles careless and cutting. Clara sat taller in her seat. The laughter no longer stung the same way. Not after she had spoken. Her scarf was straight, her head was high, and though she remained in the wrong seat, the balance had shifted. She would not let them bury her dignity quietly. Not this time. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of passengers settling into their seats, but under that ordinary noise, something heavier lingered in the air tension. Injustice. The quiet awareness that something had gone very wrong. Clara Robinson sat upright, ticket stub still clutched in her hands. Her posture deliberate and unyielding. She had spoken once, firmly, and it had rippled through the rows. Now she let the silence speak, her gaze steady, her shoulders squared. All around her, subtle reactions began to surface. The young couple across the aisle whispered to each other, glancing nervously toward the front. A man in a business suit leaned slightly forward, setting aside his tablet for a moment, eyes flicking toward Clara with a faint furrow of his brow. Even the flight attendant who had first dismissed her hesitated mid-step, noticing the attention her words had drawn. It was the quiet murmurs that unsettled the crew the most, the sister in seat 1. A noticed passenger stealing glances, the corners of her mouth twitching. She raised her champagne glass, tilting it slightly toward her sibling. The flight attendant, as if to signal, "Hold the line." The flight attendant herself walked briskly down the aisle, leaning slightly over the armrest of a passenger near Clara. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her tone still polite, but her eyes darted nervously across the cabin. She was trying to regain control, but the murmurs were no longer something she could manage easily. Clara did not flinch. "Everything is exactly as it should be," she said calmly, her voice carrying quietly but clearly enough for nearby passengers to catch, "except for the injustice that has been done." A ripple of whispers traveled like wildfire. "That's not right," someone muttered near the window seat. "She's right," another added softly. Passengers who had been passive moments ago now exchanged subtle glances, some nodding, some clutching their phones as if wanting to record or confirm the situation. The attendants tried to suppress it. A blonde crew member approached Clara again, bending slightly, attempting to mask the warning in a patronizing smile. "Ma'am, please, let's not draw attention to this. It's all settled." Clara's lips curved faintly, not in amusement, but in quiet defiance. "Settled?" she repeated softly, almost to herself. "Nothing is settled until fairness is restored." The crew's professional facade began to crack. Another attendant, standing by the galley, whispered sharply to the sister in 1A, "She's making them notice. Everyone's watching now." The sister's laugh, once casual, became slightly forced. She set down her glass and shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable under the eyes of passengers who had started leaning subtly forward, watching the confrontation unfold. Even as the murmurs spread, some passengers remained silent, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to notice. Their silence, however, only made the tension more pronounced. The ones who did speak did so quietly, but enough that Clara could feel their support, small embers of acknowledgement in the midst of injustice. And Clara, despite being displaced from her rightful seat, maintained her composure. Each passenger's glance, each whisper, each moment of hesitation from the crew strengthened her resolve. The humiliation she had endured was no longer private. It had become visible, and in that visibility lay power. The tension hung thick, like charged air before a storm. The crew tried one last time to regain control, instructing passengers to remain seated, masking their irritation with clipped smiles and polite tones. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted. Observers could see what had happened, could understand the unfairness, could sense the injustice that had been inflicted upon Clara. From her new seat at the back of the cabin, Clara allowed herself a subtle but confident inhale. She had spoken, she had held her dignity, and now the whispers, small, scattered, but undeniable, signaled that the story had begun to move beyond the crew's control. In the hush of tense murmurs, Clara realized that the first step toward justice was no longer just within her. It had begun to ripple outward. Eyes had noticed. Voices had registered. The imbalance of power had begun to tremble. The first flicker of hope had arrived, quiet but undeniable. "Wait, isn't that Clara Robinson?" A man whispered sharply to the woman beside him, his voice low but urgent. The woman's eyes widened. "Yes, the airline CEO's mother. That's her." Heads turned instantly. Phones were raised. A woman held her phone, recording, capturing Clara's calm defiance. Another passenger muttered, "They can't treat her like this." The flight attendant, noticing the sudden attention, approached Clara quickly. "Ma'am, please, maybe you should—" Clara lifted her ticket. "My seat. It belongs to me." The attendant froze. "It's settled," she said, voice tight, almost faltering. The flight attendant's sister in 1A, lounging with her champagne, caught the passenger's eyes. She straightened slightly, her confidence cracking. "Control them," she hissed to the attendant. The blonde crew member stepped forward, voice clipped and sharp. "Ma'am, no need to make this a scene." Clara's eyes swept across the rows. "This isn't a scene. It's what is right." The murmurs escalated. "She's right," a man said. "This is ridiculous," another muttered. Phones discreetly recorded, some passengers even leaning slightly to capture the interaction. The flight attendant's smile faltered. She leaned closer. "We need to maintain order. Sit down." Clara's hand tightened around the ticket. "Order is meaningless without fairness. You took what was mine. That is the injustice." Passengers reacted visibly, heads turned, glances exchanged, expressions hardening with disapproval. One young woman raised her phone steadily, recording Clara's words. A man shook his head, muttering, "I can't believe they're treating her this way." The flight attendant's sister shifted in her seat, eyes darting to passengers who were now openly observing. She leaned toward the attendant, voice tense. "They're all watching. Do something." The blonde attendant took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Ma'am, for your own sake, sit down. Stop drawing attention." Clara's voice was calm but firm. "I've been forced from my seat. I've been humiliated. I will not allow this to be ignored." The cabin was no longer a backdrop. Passengers were documenting, reacting, and questioning. Some whispered their disbelief openly. Others nodded subtly, showing acknowledgement and support. The imbalance of power had shifted. The flight attendant's sister looked down at her champagne glass, her previously smug expression replaced by unease. She realized the narrative was no longer hers to control. The more she tried to assert dominance, the more visible her anxiety became. Clara remained seated, ticket in hand, unshaken. Her words had pierced the carefully maintained illusion of authority. Passengers were now fully aware of what had happened to the stolen seat, the mocking behavior, the attempted silencing. One man muttered to another, "She's calm, dignified. This is unbelievable." A woman shook her head, recording the scene. Each movement, each word Clara spoke, was now captured, undeniable. The flight attendant tried one last time, voice tight, sharp. "Everyone, remain seated. There's nothing to see here." But the passengers ignored the plea. Phones kept recording, eyes kept watching. The power that had seemed absolute in the hands of the flight attendant and her sister had already begun to erode. Clara's resolve was quiet but absolute. She had endured the worst of their humiliation, and now the first real signs of accountability were forming in the cabin itself. The story could no longer be contained. The truth was breaking through, visible, undeniable. And in that moment, Clara knew the spark of justice had been struck. The flight attendant's sister, the crew, and the passengers, all of them, had witnessed it. A short video had made its way to Michael Robinson's desk within minutes, a passenger's clip of his mother being forced from her seat. The flight attendant's sister lounging in 1A, the crew standing by. He watched once, twice, then stood. There would be no corporate spin, no waiting for a landing report. He picked up the secure line. "This is Michael Robinson. I'm watching an incident on Flight 472 involving my mother. Stop this flight from leaving the gate. I'm coming to the aircraft now. The seat must be restored and anyone involved removed from duty immediately. Do not depart until I say otherwise." On the flight deck, Captain Davis listened, stunned by the clarity and force in the CEO's voice. He had worked with Michael before and knew the man did not bluff. "Understood, sir," the captain said. He keyed the cabin mic. "Attention all passengers and crew," Captain Davis announced, voice steady. "Flight 472 will not depart at this time. We have a report of unacceptable behavior by members of the cabin crew. We will resolve this issue before departure. Please remain seated and cooperate as we address the situation." The cabin stiffened. Phones that had been recording now shifted from furtive capture to obvious documentation. Passengers watched the galley where the implicated crew stood the flight attendant, her sister in 1A. Other staff clustered nearby, their faces draining of color. Captain Davis stepped out of the cockpit, his polished shoes clicking against the aisle floor. The murmurs in the cabin quieted instantly. Passengers sensed authority moving through the rows. His eyes locked on the flight attendant and her sister, who had barely managed to hold onto their composure. The other crew members shifted uneasily, gathering near the galley, unsure of what was coming. "Ladies," the captain began, his voice firm and carrying to the entire front section of the cabin. "Your behavior toward a passenger on this flight is completely unacceptable. Forcing someone from her seat, mocking her, and allowing this to happen in full view of everyone is a violation of every policy we uphold." The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line, her confidence evaporating. The sister in 1A, once smug and smugly perched with her champagne glass, now looked small, stiff, realizing the severity of the situation. The captain continued, walking slowly down the aisle so all nearby passengers could see. "Seat 1A is not yours to occupy under any circumstance. You will restore the passenger to her rightful seat immediately. Then you will report to the front galley to account for your actions. This aircraft will not leave this gate until this matter is resolved." The young attendant's hands trembled slightly. "Sir, we can explain," she stammered, but the captain's gaze cut across her like steel. "No explanations here. Actions will be taken. Compliance is mandatory." Passengers shifted in their seats, phones lifting discreetly to record. Eyes widened. Whispers rippled through the cabin, but the captain's presence silenced the chaos enough that the weight of authority dominated the space. The flight attendant's sister, finally rising from 1A, straightened reluctantly, her earlier arrogance replaced by unease. Other crew members shuffled toward the galley as instructed, faces pale, voices hushed. Clara sat perfectly still, her ticket visible in her lap. She did not speak, did not flinch. The balance had begun to tip. The crew who had sought to humiliate her were now exposed under the captain's command, and the passengers could see it all. Captain Davis paused at the galley, hands on the counter, looking down at the staff. "Be prepared for my report to corporate. And remember, the CEO is personally aware of this incident." The words hung in the cabin like a physical weight. The crew stiffened. Passengers murmured, some raising their phones to document the unfolding confrontation. Clara's eyes met the young attendant's for a brief second, steady, unafraid. The plane remained at the gate, the engines quiet, but the atmosphere crackled with tension. The stage was set. Every eye in the cabin knew that the arrival of Michael Robinson would escalate this confrontation beyond anything the crew had ever imagined. Passengers watched, recording, some whispering among themselves. The cabin had transformed from a scene of injustice to one of accountability, and in the distance at the jet bridge, Michael Robinson approached. The moment he stepped aboard, no one in that cabin would forget it. The cabin door hissed open. Every head turned as a tall figure in a sharp navy suit stepped into the aircraft. Michael Robinson, CEO of the airline, carried no entourage, no assistant, no delay. His face was set, eyes burning with a restrained fury that made the air itself seem to still. Passengers gasped. Phones rose higher. Many knew his face from magazines, financial reports, and television interviews. To see him here boarding a grounded flight was unthinkable, but the weight in his steps left no doubt this was not business as usual. The captain, still near the galley, straightened immediately. "Mr. Robinson," he said quietly. Michael gave a curt nod, his gaze already sweeping over the crew. "Where are they?" The captain gestured toward the cluster of attendants near the galley, the flight attendant at their center, her sister now standing just behind her. Their earlier bravado was gone, their postures small, their eyes darting nervously. Michael took 2 deliberate steps forward, his voice low but cutting through the cabin like steel. "You thought you could humiliate her? My mother?" A sharp intake of breath rippled across the passengers. Gasps, whispers, the realization dawning this wasn't just a wrong passenger. This was the CEO's mother. The young flight attendant stammered, "Sir, we didn't mean—" "Stop." Michael's voice cracked like a whip. He pointed directly at her. "You mocked her. You dragged her dignity through this cabin. And you," he turned on the sister, his eyes narrowing. "You sat in a seat you had no right to. You laughed while humiliating a woman who earned her place here with every dollar she paid. You thought no one would stop you. You thought she was no one." The sister swallowed hard, her voice breaking. You were only exposing yourselves," Michael cut in, "and now everyone is watching." He gestured with a sweeping motion to the cabin full of passengers. Phones lifted, lenses capturing every word, every second. Michael straightened, his authority absolute. "You are finished. All of you who stood by, who sneered, who allowed this step forward." A heavy silence hung in the air. 2 other attendants hesitated, then stepped closer, guilt etched on their faces. Michael's jaw tightened. "Gather your things. You're leaving this aircraft. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty." The words were final, absolute. Gasps rippled again as the magnitude sank in. Never had passengers seen an airline CEO strip crew members of their authority mid-flight boarding. The sister in 1A tried to protest. "You can't just—" "I can, and I have." Michael's voice was cold as stone. He gestured to the captain. "Escort them off. Now." The captain nodded sharply and motioned toward the exit. Security at the jet bridge stepped inside, summoned quickly by ground control. The disgraced crew shuffled forward, faces red, some fighting tears. The sister avoided Clara's eyes, her earlier smugness shattered into shame. Clara sat silent, regal, her ticket still resting in her lap. She had not moved, had not needed to. Justice was moving toward her, piece by piece, step by step. Michael turned, his gaze softening as he finally looked at her. "Mama," he said, his voice dropping for the first time, carrying a quiet weight of both love and fury. "This ends here." The passengers sat frozen, recording history. A black woman who had been humiliated moments before was now restored. Not just by her son, but by the truth, by accountability. The cabin's silence was not empty this time. It was reverence, awe, and the sound of power shifting. Michael stood tall, watching as the crew and the flight attendant's sister were escorted off the plane. Then, slowly, he turned back to the passengers. "This airline belongs to every customer who pays their fare," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "No one, not my mother, not any of you will ever be treated as less. Not while I am in charge." The passengers erupted, some clapping, some cheering, others with tears in their eyes. Clara lifted her chin slightly, her dignity not restored but vindicated, witnessed by all. And for the first time that day, the humiliation was no longer hers to bear. It belonged to those who had tried to strip her of her worth and failed. The disgraced crew shuffled toward the cabin door, heads bowed, escorted by security. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority in the sky, now looked hollow, stripped of meaning. Passengers watched every step, recording from their phones, their lenses capturing the end of arrogance in real time. The flight attendant's sister tried to keep her chin high as she passed Clara, but her lips trembled. For the first time since the boarding began, she felt what Clara had felt: exposed, powerless, and on display. Clara did not look away. Her eyes were steady, calm, and piercing, a mirror the younger woman could not bear to face. As the group disappeared into the jet bridge, the cabin broke into scattered applause. Some clapped openly, others softly, but the sound built like a wave. Passengers who had once sat in silence, complicit through their quiet, were now part of the reversal. They were no longer passive witnesses, they were allies in this moment of justice. Michael Robinson stood in the aisle, his shoulders broad, his voice steady as he addressed them. "Every passenger on this plane deserves respect. What happened today will never be repeated. You have my word on that and my accountability if it is." Phones recorded as passengers murmured approval. A man in business attire called out, "About time somebody said it." A woman with 2 children added, "We saw it all. We'll make sure the world sees it too." Michael nodded once, his eyes softening as he turned back to his mother. "Mama," he said, voice steady, "this belongs to you." Clara looked up at her son, her eyes glistening but steady. She reached for his hand, pressing it between both of hers. "You stood for me when they thought I had no voice," she whispered, her tone carrying the strength of years lived, battles fought, and dignity tested. Michael shook his head gently. "No, Mama, you've always had the voice. The world just didn't want to hear it. All I did was make sure they had no choice but to listen." Clara rose with quiet dignity. Her scarf was still neat, her posture proud. She did not need to hurry. The cabin seemed apart for her, the aisle suddenly wider, as though the respect withheld from her moments ago was now a pathway being cleared. She walked forward, slow but certain, each step a reclamation. Cameras followed, passengers leaning aside to let her pass, some nodding at her as though bowing in acknowledgement. When she reached row 1, her seat was empty at last. Seat 1A. She touched the armrest lightly, almost reverently, before lowering herself into it. Her ticket stub, still in her hand, rested on her lap as it had before. This time no one doubted it. This time no one dared question her right to it. Michael remained standing for a moment longer, his hand on the back of her seat, his presence protective yet proud. "This plane will depart only when the dignity of every passenger is secure," he declared. His words carried not just to the cabin but to the crew that remained, to the captain standing watch near the galley. The applause rose again, fuller, unrestrained. Clara adjusted her seatbelt with a steady hand, her chin high. She had not fought with screams or pleas. She had stood firm, endured, and now the world bore witness to her vindication. Passengers glanced at each other, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had seen, others already typing on their phones, uploading videos, sharing words that would soon travel far beyond the cabin walls. The injustice that had begun with laughter and arrogance had ended with exposure and accountability. And at its center sat Clara Robinson, no longer humiliated but honored, a symbol of what happens when silence breaks and truth demands its place. As Michael finally returned toward the galley to confer with the captain, Clara leaned back into her seat. For the first time since boarding, she exhaled slowly, deeply. The weight that had been forced upon her had shifted. The dignity they had tried to strip away had been restored, not quietly, not in the shadows, but in the full light of witness. And this time it was not just her victory. It was a lesson, etched into the memory of every passenger on board, captured forever on the phones they carried, waiting to be shared with the world. The cabin was still buzzing when the first clips hit social media. Passengers had uploaded everything: Clara holding her ticket, the flight attendant's sister smug in 1A, the captain confronting the crew, and finally Michael Robinson entering the cabin to restore his mother's dignity. Within minutes, the hashtag #justice for Clara was trending. Clips racked up thousands of views by the second. Commenters didn't mince words. This is why we record everything. Power abused, power corrected. Her calm is stronger than all their arrogance. News alerts flashed across screens. CEO intervenes mid-flight to defend mother from discrimination. Passengers' video exposes crew humiliating black woman in first class. Cable anchors replayed the scene of Clara lowering herself back into seat 1A, ticket in hand, her head held high. That image, a quiet black woman reclaiming what was hers in the face of open humiliation, spread like wildfire. Inside the plane, passengers whispered about what they'd just witnessed. Some uploaded reflections on the spot. "I stayed quiet when she was mocked," one admitted into his phone camera, his voice cracking. "But when her son, the CEO, stood up, it made me realize I should have spoken sooner. We all should have." Outside, activists amplified the story. Commentators drew connections to decades of black travelers being told where they didn't belong, forced to wait their turn or accept less. Clara's moment had become more than personal, it was symbolic. Back in 1A, Clara sat composed, her scarf still neat, her ticket stub resting on her lap like a badge. Michael stood beside her, one hand on the headrest as phones kept rolling. "Are you all right, Mama?" he asked quietly. Clara glanced up at him, her voice calm but resolute. "I've been through worse, son, but this is the first time the world saw it when it happened." Michael nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "And they'll never unsee it." Passengers clapped again, not as scattered applause but as one unified sound. For once, silence had broken, and dignity had not just been restored, it had been broadcast to the world. With the disgraced crew removed and the cabin still buzzing with disbelief, Michael Robinson gave his mother's hand a final squeeze. "Mama, you're safe now. Fly your flight. I'll handle the rest." Clara looked at him, her son, the man who carried the weight of an airline yet had paused everything for her. She nodded once, her eyes glistening but strong. "Go on, Michael. This plane doesn't need a CEO, it just needs to fly." Michael's lips tightened into a proud smile. He leaned down, kissed her forehead, and then stepped back toward the exit, escorted by security. Passengers recorded every step, their whispers this time not of judgment, but of awe. Few CEOs would ever walk into a cabin. Fewer still would leave it with such quiet grace. As the door closed behind him, the captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Flight 472 will now depart. On behalf of this airline, I assure you respect for every passenger is not optional. It is required." The applause that followed was not polite. It was thunderous, rolling through the cabin like a wave of release. Clara sat tall in seat 1A, adjusting her scarf, her chin high. Around her, passengers smiled, nodded, even lifted their phones in a kind of salute. The silence that had once felt heavy with humiliation was now filled with solidarity. As the plane lifted into the sky, Clara allowed herself to exhale. She had not only reclaimed her seat, she had turned her pain into a reckoning. For years, she had been told to sit quietly, to accept less, to be grateful for scraps. But now, the world was watching, and in that cabin on that day, no one could deny it. Dignity was hers, and justice had flown with her. Her son might have left the aircraft, but his promise remained. The recordings would spread, the story would rise, and so would she, not as a victim, but as a voice that could never again be ignored. Clara Robinson boarded that plane as just another passenger. She left it as a reminder to the world. Silence can humiliate, but truth will always rise.